All right, hello, portfolio viewers or normally readers. I wanted to tell you a little bit about a recent class experience I had in this UI design course I'm taking, where we were actually working through what was called a UI United Nations Accessibility Summit. And through the experience, we had the opportunity to take on a certain population's point of view, talk through accessibility concerns for that population, and then eventually actually work with a real practical essentially design decision-making process in figuring out trade-offs between these different groups from the design perspective. So really interesting activity. The way it was structured is we first actually divided up into our groups. So I was paired with another student and essentially picked the population of preteens to pitch for and to learn more about the accessibility concerns of. So we got our populations, a bunch of different teams. We all did brief 5-minute presentations on the accessibility concerns for those different groups. So, what you have to think about when it comes to the experience that those groups have in UI design, how those experiences transcend that group into other groups, and then how to actually practically do something about it and serve those different groups' needs. And then after the presentations in the next class period, we actually grabbed different corners of the room and we were tasked with looking at a Nebraska vaccine registration site. And we were literally just going around like sort of Congress members at this United Nations summit and arguing for our group's perspective to be heard when it comes to UI design changes to this vaccination website. So really cool experience. Had an opportunity to fight for the preteen population, hear from all kinds of different perspectives when it comes to accessibility, and overall learned a lot about what makes accessibility so hard and what makes making trade-offs in the design process so difficult. So in terms of preteens, it's a really interesting population to think about because there are more children than there ever have been before interacting with the web. There are around 30 to 40 million preteens in the United States, and more so than ever, they're interacting with the internet through smartphones, tablets, laptops, in ways that obviously no previous generation has had the opportunity to before. And so because of that, from a design perspective, in a lot of general situations, we're doing a really poor job of designing, knowing that children are using the websites that we produce. So the experiences that preteens look for, they're very curious, they're very inquisitive, they love touching everything. That's just how they learn. They're very experiential learners, as we're all wired to be when we're young. And so when you think about building an interface for preteens, you have to think about building something first off that's digestible for them. Obviously, their brains are still developing, limited motor functions compared to other adults, and obviously they can't read in a lot of cases, or their reading level is way lower than ours. And so first off, you have to account for all of those things, but then also importantly, you have to build something that actually engages them, because similarly to adults, children's attention spans are limited, and if you're not capturing their attention really quickly out the gate, then you're probably not building something they're going to stick around and actually get value out of. So in that respect, it really does transcend beyond the group of preteens and their experiences and how you actually design for them, in the sense that people have short attention spans. A lot of times they're going to be limited in the way they interact with your website. They might be on mobile where they're using one hand. They might be on a laptop, but caught between two different things and multitasking and not really processing fully what's going on. And so building something that's engaging, visually stimulating, and really easy to digest, not super long blocks of text, all that stuff is really important even beyond the preteen population, which is a really interesting thing to think about as we entered into the negotiation phase after this presentation at this UIUN Accessibility Summit. So in terms of how the actual negotiations went when we were at this summit, we essentially first started off at our station going through. We had a shared Google Slides document where we were all essentially making suggestions for changes to this Nebraska registration site. So there would be a slide on, let's say, buttons, and there'd be a slide on menus, and there'd be a slide on headers. And in each one of those slides, a group could essentially write something to say this is a priority. They'd give it a priority label from 1 to 5 and claim that as a priority of their group. Now, the interesting thing is, anytime a group wanted to disagree with someone's priority or add something they think is a higher priority when it comes to, for example, the design of buttons, they would have to go to that group and negotiate for their thing to be a higher priority or to change an existing thing that was added by another group. So created a lot of really interesting dynamic among different groups. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the disagreements we had with different groups, some of the agreements we did have with other groups, and ultimately where we think we ended up in fighting for preteens to be designed for this Nebraska vaccination website. So the first thing that we immediately, me and my partner went out the gate and fought for. One of the first things that me and my partner out the gate fought for was for more accessible for preteens buttons and hyperlinks. So especially for kids, buttons are a really interesting thing. Children like to touch everywhere, as I said, in a particular user interface. And so first thing really important for children actually is firing events when you click a button on press rather than on release. Because a lot of times children actually don't press buttons fully, or they'll kind of press a button and slide their finger in a way that the button won't register if it's not fired on press versus on release. So that was one thing we fought for out the gate. We also fought for buttons and hyperlinks to be large and also use symbols that are commonly used to represent buttons. So an example of that might be a search bar. A button for searching would include a magnifying glass and not something else that would be harder to understand. And that button would be prominent and easy to see, contrasting with the background visually, so that a child could actually recognize that that's something that's clickable, that's a button. Another example might be a menu. You typically have what's called a hamburger icon, like the 3 lines. Very common UI practice for a symbol to use that ultimately it's important that your buttons are aware of. Your button should be using commonly used symbols that represent things that are clickable. Once we got our initial ideas out there for buttons, put priorities on those, highest priorities that we could, we immediately went over to headings and started adding basically descriptors for the page headings to be accompanied by a symbol, to be accompanied by an image, or to be colorful. Basically doing whatever we can to make the page visually stimulating and engaging for children. When you hop on a page and you have a big wall of text that isn't divided by images, headers that are clearly distinguishable or colorful, makes it really hard for a child to want to engage with that page. So that was another thing we added right out the gate. So from there, we really entered into negotiation for all kinds of other different UI concerns with all kinds of other different groups. So some examples of some of the more interesting discussions we had. One particular instance, we were talking with a group that was focused on people with dyslexia and helping them basically process information better. And we had an interesting disagreement about the desired reading level of the text that was on the page. The people who were fighting for those with dyslexia were arguing for a 7th or 8th grade reading level, a reading level that is a really commonplace reading level for all people. Whereas we were actually arguing for something closer to 5th or 6th grade, closer to the age that preteens would actually be able to potentially understand, especially with the consideration that in a lot of cases, especially if you're in a household where English is a second language, a lot of times the kid is the one that's going to have to interact with that page and actually complete that vaccination registration. So there was a little bit of discussion there, a little bit of argumentation. We eventually settled on, I believe, compromising on like a 6th and 7th grade reading level. But just disagreements like that, like subtle things that are not necessarily like completely contrasting points of view, but there are subtle differences that oftentimes you don't think about when you're not thinking specifically with the hat of a different group and how they're thinking about things. On that note, I'll quickly say we actually did have a lot of commonalities with the group that was focusing on households with English as a second language, specifically because that was a common thing that we were thinking about. The fact that for a lot of children who are interacting with this website, especially those who are going to be going through the registration process themselves for a parent, a lot of times that's going to be in a household where the parent maybe doesn't understand English as well as their own child does. Another example of compromising that we did was talking with a group for photosensitivity. We were actually arguing, not really a compromise in this case, but we were actually arguing for all media on the page to be specifically G-rated so that children could actually be allowed to process that information and to get that kind of video. That was one of the things we fought for. We also, interestingly, fought a lot with the group fighting for baby boomers, specifically when it comes to forms and filling out form information. we were arguing that for children, especially for something that would make the process feel more rewarding, since children generally don't like filling out forms or are oftentimes not capable of doing that, it would be helpful to include a progress bar on the bottom of the form page, and throughout the process have a little confetti animation coming out of that progress bar as a child was going through it, especially for a parent, for example. The baby boomer group did not like the idea of having confetti raining down on the page over and over. There was some discussion about that. Ultimately, though, in that case, there was ultimately some common ground on having a progress bar in the first place as you filled out the form. And so another example of a place where ultimately the accessibility concerns of these different groups are oftentimes actually aligned in a lot of ways, which makes you realize that in a lot of instances, including a progress bar in your form is not building accessible design and just building like good design. Like that's something that everyone can get behind and agree is an important thing. So to just quickly, succinctly describe some of our unlikely allies and unlikely opponents, typically we were agreeing with groups that face similar challenges to children. We have people who are mentally challenged, people with dyslexia who have trouble reading. A lot of those things actually align really well with children because, as we've talked about, children can't process information as quickly as adults can. And so that's something that they are dealing with as they interact with every web page that they use online. Some of the groups that we had more troubles with were groups like baby boomers who just in general like look at the world differently. Someone who's above the age of 65 is looking for a quick way to register for the vaccine, no frills. They don't need all this crazy flashing information and media. They just want something where they can sign up and get the vaccine. Whereas a child really is actually probably going to this in a lot of cases with a different purpose in mind, and that's to just learn about what's going on with this vaccine thing. And they probably just don't have a lot of the context that adults do in the first place. So those differences of just background and purpose and context are the biggest differentiator in groups that we aligned well with and groups that we didn't. It was definitely a hard process negotiating with different groups for priority, especially as you got into the weeds of, this particular thing is a priority 4 or this particular thing's a priority 5. Because in a lot of cases, like if you're a web developer for the state of Nebraska, for example, or for a particular county, Sarpy County in this case, you don't have the time or the ability on your team probably to reach all of these different priorities, especially with something like a vaccine. You're trying to push out a website as quickly as you can and start getting people vaccinated. So with that in mind, as we were going through these negotiations, it became pretty clear, if you're fighting for something that's a 3-2 priority or below, you're starting to get to the point where, what you're fighting for might not even be included in the final version of, or at least the first version of what is being built. So because of that, a lot of the arguments that were more intense were exacerbated by the fact that they were fighting for something to be a 4 or 5 that another group didn't think was that quite high priority, but still thought was important. Example, progress bars. Something that everyone can kind of agree upon. We at least gathered that consensus from a lot of different groups, but actually fighting for that to be a 4 or 5 priority when compared to other basic considerations about building good forms, that was a hard thing. And so in our final version of what we came up with as a collective group, we won't have progress bars on our first version likely, despite that being something that a lot of people agreed upon. Those are the kind of takeaways that I think were the most enlightening to me. Just the fact that there are so many different accessibility considerations that you can be the most conscientious designer out there and build something with true intention to be extremely accessible to as many groups as possible. And a lot of times at the end of the day, you're going to have to make sacrifices simply because of the time and the resources that you have to build something and get it out fast. Literally in the case of COVID, to actually save lives and get people vaccinated faster. And so ultimately, this is a really great experience from that perspective. And I'll take away from this just the simple importance of negotiation and priority as it comes to building things that meet the needs of most people. A lot of times people don't go into building websites that aren't accessible. They go into building websites to meet the needs of as many people as they can, and then just by nature of the first version don't have a time to build something that's as accessible as it could be to particular groups. So I think, that learning comes with some empathy for a lot of web designers, that you think, that this interface is not as good as it could be, but simply from a time perspective, it's hard. You're negotiating with people who have different priorities. And yeah, a really valuable experience from that sort of like product management perspective almost, and just how hard it is to build something accessible, but importantly still how critical it is to do so. So yeah, I appreciate you watching this video. It was a really enlightening experience for me, and be on the lookout for future portfolio updates.